The lake stretched out before me, its surface like glass, barely disturbed by the occasional ripple from a passing breeze or the gentle splash of my lure hitting the water. The early morning sun had just started to peek over the treetops, casting long, golden rays that danced across the water. There was a familiar smell in the air, clean and crisp, tinged with the earthy scent of damp pine needles and fresh dew. This was my sanctuary, where the weight of the world always seemed to lighten, even if just for a few hours. The steady hum of cicadas in the distance and the rhythmic sound of water lapping against the boat were the only things I could hear, aside from my own slow breathing. For as long as I could remember, this lake had been my escape. Out here, with a rod in hand and nothing but time, I could forget about everything waiting for me back at home. There was something pure about the act of fishing, something meditative. Cast, wait, reel. Cast, wait, reel. I didn't need to think too hard, didn't need to talk to anyone. Just me, the line, and the hope of a bite. But today, that comfort felt a little different. There was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind, like the tug of a fish you weren't sure you wanted to pull in. I couldn't quite shake it. I glanced down at the water, watching the soft ripples break up the reflection of the sky. The unease had been creeping in for months now. At first, it was small things, easy to dismiss. Jane had been distant, preoccupied. I'd convinced myself it was nothing. But sitting out here, alone with my thoughts, it was hard to ignore the growing tension. I tried to focus on the stillness around me, on the way the sunlight sparkled on the water, but the peace I usually felt seemed just out of reach. I cast the line again, watching as it disappeared into the lake's depths. The world around me was as calm as ever, but inside, a storm was brewing. And deep down, I had a feeling that nothing was going to be the same after today. As I sat in the boat, watching the line drift lazily on the water, memories of Jane's odd behavior over the past few months crept into my mind. They had been nagging at me for a while now, but I'd always been good at brushing things off, convincing myself it was nothing. There was that time, a few weeks ago, when she had come home late from work, distracted, barely meeting my eyes when I asked how her day was. She'd mumbled something about a long meeting, but her voice had sounded distant, almost rehearsed. I had noticed it, of course, but didn't want to start a fight over it. She had always been busy with work, and I told myself that stress could make anyone seem a little off. Then there was the weekend when we were supposed to have dinner with some friends. Jane had been unusually quiet, hardly touching her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. I remember joking with her about it, trying to snap her out of whatever mood she was in. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I should have pressed her, asked what was really going on, but instead, I let it slide. After all, she had always been a little reserved. I chalked it up to one of those phases that couples go through, telling myself we'd work through it eventually. The sound of a bird calling in the distance pulled me back to the lake. I adjusted my grip on the rod, trying to shake off the uneasy memories. Fishing was supposed to clear my head, not fill it with doubts. But it wasn't just the little things like her silence at dinner or the way she avoided my touch sometimes. It was the bigger moments too, like when I'd caught her looking at her phone, quickly hiding it when I walked into the room. I'd laughed it off, joking that she must be hiding a surprise for me. She just smiled, a thin, forced smile, and I let it go. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband. I looked out over the water again, the sunlight reflecting off the ripples, hoping the tranquility of the lake could quiet my mind. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the gentle rocking of the boat and the distant splash of a fish jumping, the doubts kept creeping back in. They'd been there all along, really, like shadows I couldn't quite shake. Maybe I didn't want to see what was right in front of me. Maybe, out here, with nothing but time and the sound of the water, I couldn't avoid the truth anymore. Still, I cast the line again, refusing to dwell on it. This was supposed to be my escape, my refuge. But somehow, even here, the tension followed me. I was sitting in the boat, enjoying the quiet stillness of the morning, when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. Out here, calls were a rare intrusion, and I didn't want anything ruining the peace. But when I saw the doctor's number on the screen, I knew I couldn't ignore it. My stomach tightened, and suddenly the calmness of the lake felt miles away. I had been waiting for this call for weeks, though no part of me was ready to hear what was coming. "Mr. Weston," the doctor's voice came through the line, steady but with that tone. The one they use when they're about to say something you'll never forget. "The results came back from your tests. I'm afraid it's stage 4 pancreatic cancer." Everything around me seemed to freeze. The light breeze, the soft lapping of the water against the boat, all of it stopped. The words hit like a punch to the gut, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. Stage 4. I didn't need him to explain what that meant. I knew. Everyone knew. I tried to focus on his words as he went on about treatment options and timelines, but it was like listening through thick glass. Distant. Hollow. I stared out at the lake, my eyes locking onto the tip of my fishing rod, as if concentrating on it would somehow keep me grounded. But inside, everything was spinning out of control. I barely managed to mumble something in response before hanging up. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the water, the rod in my hand forgotten. I'd known something was wrong, deep down, I'd known for a while. But hearing it out loud, having it confirmed, made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Stage 4. There's no coming back from that. This was it. My time was running out, and nothing could stop it. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it stayed lodged there, heavy and thick. I gripped the rod a little tighter, focusing on the feel of the handle in my hands, the weight of it, anything to distract myself from the words echoing in my head. The lake had always been my escape, the one place where nothing could reach me. But not today. Not with this news. I cast the line out again, watching the lure disappear into the water, hoping the motion would calm me, give me something, anything else to think about. But the quiet of the lake, which had always brought me peace, now felt oppressive. It pressed in on me, like the silence was mocking me. I was alone out here with the biggest news of my life, and all I could do was sit and fish, pretending for a few moments longer that everything was fine. My mind drifted back to Jane, to how I was going to tell her. Or if I even wanted to. How do you look someone in the eyes and tell them you're dying? The thought made my chest tighten even more, so I forced it away, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of casting, reeling, casting again. But no matter how hard I tried, the enormity of it all kept creeping back in, drowning out the simple pleasure of the act. There was no escaping this. Not even here. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the water fill the silence. I was out here to fish, to feel normal, but there was nothing normal about any of this. I was dying, and suddenly the lake, the place that had always been my sanctuary, felt like just another reminder of how little time I had left. The drive home felt longer than usual, even though I'd taken this road countless times before. The truck's engine hummed steadily beneath me, and the countryside blurred past, but my mind was miles away. I kept replaying the doctor's words in my head, trying to figure out how I was going to tell Jane. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. How do you even begin a conversation like that? There was no easy way to say, "I'm dying." The radio was off. I didn't want any music, didn't want any distractions. I needed to think, to figure out the right words. But no matter how many times I rehearsed it in my mind, nothing felt right. The thought of seeing the look on her face when I told her, it twisted my stomach in knots. Would she cry? Would she try to comfort me? Or would she go quiet, the way she did when something was too heavy to handle? I'd seen that look before, the one where she seemed to retreat inside herself, shutting me out. Lately, it had been happening more often, but I had convinced myself it was just stress. That's what I told myself. The road stretched ahead of me, long and winding, but all I could think about was the house waiting at the end of it. Our house. Our life. Everything was about to change. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white, trying to steady the nervous energy building inside me. There was no going back after this. Once I told her, everything would be different. I couldn't help but wonder how she would take it, if she'd fall apart or if she'd be strong for me. For us. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, realizing I was getting home earlier than I'd planned. Maybe that was a good thing. I wanted to do this face to face, not over a phone call, and definitely not over dinner. I wanted it to be personal. Intimate. Jane deserved that much. We'd been through a lot together, and I knew she'd be my rock in this, even if part of me dreaded the inevitable sadness. But as I got closer to home, a strange unease started to creep in. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of doubt I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the weight of what I was about to say, or maybe it was something else, something I didn't want to name. I brushed it aside, convincing myself I was just nervous about the conversation. Who wouldn't be? The sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road as I turned into our street. I pulled into the driveway and noticed another car parked there. Flashy, expensive, and immediately recognizable, one of my business partner's cars. The sight of it caught me off guard. He'd never been to our house without me before. I frowned, wondering why he'd be here now, of all times. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just dropping something off for Jane, some business papers or a gift, who knew? Still, something didn't sit right. The house was quiet, too quiet, and that odd feeling in the pit of my stomach started to grow. I reached for my phone, out of habit more than anything, and pulled up the security camera feed. The system wasn't recording. Privacy mode. I stared at the screen, unease quickly turning into something sharper. I tried to shake it off, this was probably nothing. But as I sat there in the driveway, staring at the house where my wife and my business partner were inside, my gut told me that the life-altering conversation I'd been dreading wasn't the only one waiting for me today. As I turned the corner onto our street, the familiar sight of our house came into view. The same old white siding, the porch swing Jane loved so much, and the big oak tree out front that had stood like a sentinel for years. It should have felt comforting, like coming home always did. But something was off. There, parked in the driveway, was a car I knew too well, sleek, silver, and far too flashy for this neighborhood. It was my business partner's. The personalized license plate made sure there was no mistaking it. My heart skipped a beat, and a strange, cold feeling started to creep over me. What the hell was he doing here? I let the truck idle for a moment, just staring at the car, my hand still on the steering wheel. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was dropping something off, papers, a contract, some business we hadn't gotten around to finishing. But even as I tried to convince myself, the pit in my stomach grew. This wasn't normal. He'd never come to the house without a reason, and he sure as hell never dropped by when I wasn't home. The air felt heavier all of a sudden. The kind of weight that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe, but I forced myself to take a deep breath. I could feel my pulse in my ears, a steady thump-thump-thump that only seemed to get louder as I sat there, frozen in my own driveway. The steering wheel felt like ice beneath my fingers. I clenched my jaw and tried to reason with myself. This wasn't a big deal. It couldn't be. Maybe Jane had called him over to discuss something. That was it. Nothing more. Right? I glanced down at my phone out of habit, opening the app for our home security system. The cameras weren't recording. Privacy mode was on. That wasn't something Jane ever touched, and it wasn't like I had turned it on. A knot twisted in my gut, tighter and tighter, but still, I told myself not to overthink it. It was probably a coincidence. I shifted the truck into park, the sound of the engine dying out leaving a strange, hollow silence. I stared at the house again, squinting through the windshield, trying to spot any sign of life. The blinds were drawn, the curtains pulled shut, something Jane always did when she wanted the house to feel cozy. That was it, I told myself. Cozy. Just a quiet afternoon with a friend. But even as I thought it, the word felt wrong. Too simple. Too innocent. I grabbed the keys and slowly opened the door, stepping out into the driveway. The air felt thick, like I was walking through molasses. Each step toward the house felt heavier than the last, my boots crunching on the gravel louder than they should have. My mind raced, bouncing between rational explanations and the growing sense that something was very, very wrong. The front door loomed in front of me now. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. For a second, I almost turned back, almost decided to go for a walk around the block to clear my head. But that damn car, sitting there like a bad omen, wouldn't let me. I needed answers. I needed to know why he was here. I pushed open the door slowly, the hinges creaking like they always did, and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I stood in the entryway, listening for voices, for movement, anything that would tell me this was all in my head. But the only sound I could hear was the faint ticking of the wall clock. That, and the deepening silence that hung over everything like a storm about to break. I took a step forward, the growing dread tightening its grip around me, but still, I held onto that last sliver of hope, praying that when I turned the corner, I wouldn't find what I feared most. Sitting alone in the fishing cabin, I stared at the computer screen, my hand hovering over the mouse. I didn't want to know. But I couldn't ignore that gnawing feeling in my gut after seeing his car in my driveway. My stomach twisted, my breath coming slow and shallow as I hesitated to click play. The backup footage from our home cameras was right in front of me. I knew it would confirm what I was afraid of. Still, a part of me hoped I was wrong. I clicked the mouse, and the footage began. At first, everything looked normal. The living room appeared just as I'd left it, the couch where we'd watched TV together, the coffee table littered with magazines, the framed photos of us on the walls. Then Jane walked into view. She was holding a glass of wine, her hair falling over her shoulders, and she looked different, happy. More alive than she'd been in months. Then he stepped into frame. My business partner. A cold wave washed over me. They were standing too close, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I watched Jane touch his arm, a soft, familiar gesture. The way she used to touch me. My stomach turned, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they were just talking, maybe this was a misunderstanding. But as the minutes ticked by, the reality started to sink in. They moved to the kitchen, dancing together like they were at some romantic getaway. She rested her head on his shoulder, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years. My hands tightened around the edge of the desk, knuckles white. This wasn't just a friendly visit. I knew it. The knot in my gut tightened, but I couldn't look away. Then they left the room, heading upstairs. I fast-forwarded the footage, my fingers trembling as I watched. There were no cameras in the bedroom, but the microphones picked up everything. The sounds that followed, the laughter, the whispers, made it impossible to deny the truth any longer. I froze, staring at the screen. It was like the world had stopped moving, and the air in the cabin felt thick and heavy. My heart pounded, and for a long time, I didn't move. I didn't know what to feel, shock, anger, sadness. They all hit me at once, overwhelming and numbing at the same time. This was the woman I'd loved for over 2 decades, the woman I'd built a life with. And she was betraying me. Not just emotionally, physically, in my home. The betrayal was so deep, it felt like a knife to the gut. I tried to breathe, but each breath came out ragged, my chest tight and aching. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the screen. The footage had stopped, but the images were burned into my mind, Jane smiling at him, laughing with him, touching him. I felt hollow, like everything inside me had been scraped out and discarded. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to release the rage building inside me, but I just sat there, numb. What now? What was I supposed to do? I had come home that afternoon, planning to tell her about my diagnosis, about the terminal illness that would change both of our lives forever. I'd imagined she would hold me, cry with me, promise to be there until the end. But now, it was all meaningless. That conversation didn't matter anymore. I stood up, pacing the small cabin. The weight of it all pressed down on me, my illness, her betrayal, the end of everything we'd built together. I felt like I was drowning, suffocated by the enormity of it. I thought about confronting her, driving back and demanding answers, but what would that solve? The damage was done. The love I once had for her was gone, replaced by a cold emptiness. She wasn't the woman I thought I knew, and I wasn't the man I used to be. Sitting back down at the desk, I closed the video player and shut the laptop. I couldn't watch anymore. I didn't need to. The truth was clear, and it hurt more than I could ever have imagined. I stared at the wall, trying to process it all, but I couldn't. Not now. In one afternoon, I had lost my future to cancer and my past to her betrayal. And now, I was left alone in this quiet cabin, surrounded by nothing but the cold, hard truth. The fishing cabin, once my escape, now felt stifling. The silence, which used to bring peace, was oppressive, like it was pushing down on me. I stared out the window at the lake, but its stillness couldn't calm the storm inside. In the space of one afternoon, I had learned two devastating truths: I was dying, and my wife was cheating. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor's words had hit me like a sledgehammer, but I hadn't processed them yet. How could I? I hadn't told anyone, not even Jane. I came back home from the lake, prepared to share the worst news of my life. I had imagined her reaction, the tears, the way she'd hold me, tell me we'd face it together. But when I pulled into the driveway, there was his car, my business partner's. I didn't go inside. I couldn't. Instead, I turned around and drove straight here, to the cabin, where the backup security footage from our home cameras was stored. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to know. But after sitting in silence for what felt like hours, I opened the laptop and hit play. There they were, Jane and my business partner, sitting together in the living room. At first, it seemed innocent enough, but then I noticed the way she touched his arm, the way they leaned in close, sharing quiet laughter. I felt sick. And then, they started dancing, right there, in our home, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The way she looked at him, the softness in her eyes, told me everything I needed to know. They disappeared upstairs, and I couldn't watch anymore. I turned off the video, but the damage was done. I sat there, numb, trying to process what I'd just seen. My wife, the woman I'd spent 2 decades with, was betraying me. And I had been too blind, too distracted by my own illness, to see it. The betrayal cut deeper than the diagnosis. I had prepared myself for death, in some way. I knew the cancer would take me. But Jane, her betrayal was something I hadn't seen coming. It felt like she had already left me, like I was alone in this fight before it had even begun. I stood up, pacing the small cabin, my thoughts spinning. How could this be happening? How could I face her now, knowing what I knew? I thought about confronting her, about throwing it all in her face. But I didn't have the strength. The cancer was already draining me, and now this had taken what little I had left. I stopped by the window, staring out at the lake, but the view that once calmed me only added to the emptiness. What was the point in telling her about the cancer now? Would she even care? The thought of her pretending to be supportive, knowing she was with someone else, made my stomach turn. But keeping it to myself, suffering in silence, felt just as unbearable. I sat back down, my body heavy, the cold air of the cabin seeping into my bones. I had never felt so alone. The diagnosis was bad enough, but Jane's affair had taken more than my future, it had taken everything we had built together. I thought I could rely on her. Now, it felt like I had nothing left. The cabin, once my refuge, now felt like a tomb, a place where I came to face the end alone. I had lost everything in one day. My future was gone, my marriage was in ruins, and I was left with the crushing reality that I would die not only from cancer but with a heart hollowed out by betrayal. Sitting in the cabin's quiet, staring at the flickering screen of the laptop, I knew one thing for sure: I didn't have the energy to confront Jane. The betrayal was a knife in my gut, but so was the cancer. The idea of walking into the house and tearing apart everything we had built felt impossible. There was no fight left in me, no desire for the kind of blowout scene you see in movies. What would it change? I was dying. Whether I screamed, cried, or raged, none of it would undo what had already happened. The thought of confronting her, demanding answers, seemed exhausting. And what would she say? What could she say to make any of it better? There was no explanation that would heal this. The reality was simple. Jane had already checked out of our marriage. Maybe she hadn't even known about the cancer, but that didn't change the fact that she'd betrayed me. If anything, the fact that she was living this lie while I was facing my mortality made it worse. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. My mind ran through the options, and none of them ended well. Confronting her would mean days, maybe weeks, of arguments, accusations, and broken promises. I'd spend what little time I had left drowning in anger and bitterness. And the truth was, I didn't want that. I couldn't waste the time I had left on rage. So, I made a decision. No confrontation. No drama. I wasn't going to spend my final months tangled up in that mess. I was done with it. I would focus on what mattered, my kids, my grandkids, the people I actually wanted to leave something behind for. Jane could have her affair, and I'd walk away with whatever dignity I had left. I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer. He answered on the third ring, and after some small talk, I told him what was going on. The cancer. The affair. My decision to let it go, at least for now. I want to make sure everything is in order, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I don't want Jane to get a cent more than she's legally entitled to when I'm gone. There was a pause on the other end, as if he was processing it all. Then he spoke, his voice calm, professional. We reviewed the prenup, went over my will, and made sure the assets would go to my children and grandchildren. I had planned well for this moment, long before I knew it was coming. Jane would be taken care of, sure, but she wouldn't walk away with anything more than what was fair. That, at least, gave me some control over the situation. Control I desperately needed. I hung up the phone and let out a long breath, feeling a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was a plan. It was a way to navigate the end of my life without losing myself to bitterness. I didn't need Jane's lies poisoning my final days. I could handle this on my own terms, and in my own way. I knew I wasn't going to tell Jane about the cancer. What would be the point? She had already distanced herself from me, emotionally, physically, and everything in between. If I told her, she'd pretend to care. She'd cry, she'd hold my hand, and maybe even promise to stay. But it would be a lie. She wasn't with me anymore. Not really. And I didn't need her pity. I'd play the role for now. I'd get through the holidays, give my kids and grandkids one last good memory of me. I could pretend, for their sake. I'd be the doting husband, the loving father and grandfather, the man everyone expected me to be. I would make sure my kids remembered me with love, not as some broken shell of myself consumed by grief and anger. Once the holidays were over, I'd quietly withdraw. I'd spend the last few months of my life on my own terms. No big drama, no messy divorce. Just a quiet exit. Maybe I'd spend more time at the cabin, fishing, enjoying the last few moments of peace I could carve out for myself. I didn't know how much time I had left, but whatever was there, I wasn't going to waste it on a fight that wouldn't change anything. I sat in the dim light of the cabin, feeling a strange calm settle over me. The weight of what had happened hadn't disappeared, it never would, but I had a plan now. I had a way to get through this without being destroyed by it. I wasn't going to be the man who let betrayal and illness define him. I'd handle this the way I'd handled everything in life, quietly, pragmatically, with dignity. This was my decision. My last stand, in a way. I couldn't control the cancer, couldn't stop the inevitable, but I could control how I spent my last days. And I would spend them on my own terms, even if it meant walking away from everything I thought I knew. When I got home that evening, Jane greeted me with her usual smile. To anyone else, it would have seemed warm, genuine even. But I knew better now. The smile I had once cherished felt hollow, a mask that hid the truth. I had seen what lay beneath it, her betrayal with him, and now every touch, every glance, felt like a lie. But I smiled back, calm and steady, just like always. It was almost like playing a role in a play I no longer cared about. We went about our routine. Dinner was quiet, uneventful. Jane chatted about her day, about plans for the holidays. I nodded in all the right places, gave the expected responses, but inside, I was miles away. Each word she spoke felt distant, like a low hum I couldn't fully tune into. My thoughts were on the betrayal, on the cancer. But none of that showed on my face. On the outside, I was the same man she had always known. I played the part of the husband, attentive, calm, unshaken. But inside, I was already gone. I didn't ask about her affair, didn't confront her about the lies. I let it sit between us like an invisible wall, thickening with each passing moment. She didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care to. I wasn't sure anymore. In a way, that hurt even more, the ease with which she carried on, the casual way she slipped through the days, as if nothing had changed. As the days passed, I withdrew further, quietly fading from the relationship. She didn't see it, and I didn't make it obvious. I went through the motions, kept up appearances, but my mind was already preparing for the end. The end of us, the end of me. I knew it was coming. My body was starting to feel the weight of the illness, tired more often, pain creeping in where it hadn't been before. But I still kept it from her, still played the part. It was easier that way. The holidays came and went, filled with laughter and family, moments that felt bittersweet. I watched the kids and grandkids open gifts, smiled through the celebrations, knowing it would be my last Christmas with them. I poured everything I had left into those moments, wanting to leave them with something good to remember. Jane stood by my side, smiling for the family photos, but I barely felt her presence. She was already a ghost to me, and soon, I would be one to her. Then, the day came when I knew it was time. I packed up my gear and left for one final fishing trip. The lake was quiet when I arrived, the water still and glassy under the pale winter sun. I pushed the boat out, the familiar creak of the oars cutting through the silence. It felt good to be back on the water, even with everything that had happened. This place, this act, it had always been my refuge. Out here, I wasn't the man with cancer, or the man with a broken marriage. I was just me, alone with the lake. I cast my line into the water, watching as it disappeared into the depths. The world was so quiet, almost peaceful. I sat there for a long time, just thinking. About my life, about Jane, about all the choices I had made. There were regrets, sure, things I wished I had done differently. But I didn't feel anger anymore. Not at Jane, not even at the cancer. The betrayal still hurt, but it wasn't consuming me like it had in those first days. It had faded into the background, just another part of the life I had lived. The cancer would take me soon enough, and I had accepted that. I couldn't fight it anymore. The pain had gotten worse, the tiredness deeper, but out here on the lake, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I had done what I needed to do. The kids were taken care of, the family would be fine, and Jane, well, she had her own life now, whether I was in it or not. As the sun began to set, casting the lake in hues of orange and pink, I felt a strange sense of peace. I hadn't expected it, but there it was. Life hadn't turned out the way I thought it would. I wasn't leaving on the terms I had imagined. But I had lived it the best I could, and in the end, that was enough. I reeled in the line, packed up my gear, and sat there for a moment longer, watching the last light fade from the sky. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter. Just tired. And ready. With a final look at the lake, I turned the boat back toward shore. It was time to go home.